Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the TribCast for December 16th. My name is Eleanor Klibanoff, as always, law and politics reporter at the Texas Tribune. We are not joined today by Matthew Watkins, who had to go out of town, but we are joined by two very special guests from the Tribune's education team. We are joined by Jaden Edison. Jaden, welcome back.
Thank you. Glad to be here, I should say.
And Sneha Day, welcome, I think, for the first time to the TribCast.
Second.
Mm-hmm. Oh, did you do the episode on STAR tests?
I did.
Which, as we were just discussing before this, Matthew was always pushing to do an episode on STAR test. And I've said this on this podcast before, I think every reporter, every person in this world should be allowed to choose a couple topics that they don't care about. Otherwise, there's too much to care about. And I decided a while ago, for me, that was going to be STAR tests. I don't have children. I was like, I care about schools. I care about school takeovers. I care about all of this. STAR test, I'm just going to check out on. And so Matthew did that episode while I was out of the country.
Oh, yeah. Well,
and now,
I took the STAR test, so that's my like.
Thoughts? Pro, con?
Yeah, you know, it is what it is, I guess,
Scheduled a getaway, but apparently not for long enough.
Yeah.
So I come back, and this is what I get, 4 months later, penalized by having to talk about school ratings.
And the STAR test is
a big part of this.
Yeah,
we're not going to not be able to talk about the STAR test.
So, yeah.
Yeah, spoiler alert, we are here today to talk about school takeovers and sort of state intervention on school districts, which we had talked about as an episode of the TribCast to do before the end of the year. And then we thought, well, there's so much news happening. We'll put it off and do it early next year. And then the Texas Education Agency said, not so fast. We're going to take over. Never mind.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas. We're going to take over a couple more districts. We're going to put it back in the news. And so really glad you guys are able to join us to help us understand, what this all means.
Sure, yeah. Glad to be here.
So it's been a bumpy year for Texas school districts. We've had a number of districts, particularly in the last couple of weeks, facing state takeovers. We've got others that are, dealing with sort of the ripple effects of still being under state scrutiny or being sort of on the precipice of it. The whole system of how we measure schools and how they're doing and how students are doing and testing and all of that has been under a lot of uncertainty. Most recently, if people have read about this, it's probably because last week the Texas Education Agency announced they were taking over the Beaumont, Connolly, and Lake Worth school districts. We throw this term around a lot, right? Like state takeover of a school district. Jaden, what does that mean?
Yeah, in simple terms, I would think of it as shifting control of a school district from local control, which we know a lot of people in Texas and nationally really care about, to state control. And so under the Texas context, a state takeover, otherwise referred to by the Texas Education Agency as an intervention, right? They'll actually push back on the term takeover,
okay.
But it's a national term used in education, so it's not exclusive to Texas. But nonetheless, state law allows the education commissioner, if there's a case where a school district has at least one campus that receives 5 consecutive failing grades in the state's academic accountability system, it basically triggers, a decision by the commissioner. Either close the campus or replace the local school district with what's known as a board of managers, which are basically state appointed. So those are going to be appointed by the commissioner. In many of these cases, too, it's a new superintendent as well. And also what's known as a conservator, which basically, that role, has a lot of authority to really make sure that during the transition and beyond that, elected school board members and others are doing what they need to do to basically comply with whatever the academic turnaround plan is. So, again, it's more nuanced than just quote unquote takeover. But I think, in simple terms, the shift from local control to state control, of the governance of the district.
I think what Jaden is saying is really key here, because education has so long been really decisions that have been made at a local level. It's primarily been driven by local decisions made by a local school board, and that is elected by the community that they are meant to serve. And so what we're having is increasingly so the Texas Education Agency commissioner come in and oust that entire democratically elected school board and appoint his people who are making then decisions about communities across the state. So we're seeing more of an influence of the state coming in and making decisions about how classrooms are run and how students are being taught.
And I think if people feel like, well, this is like feels like this is happening a lot more recently. Like this it certainly was like not something I knew about like growing up. I mean, this is a relatively new phenomenon, right? The legislature empowered the Texas Education Agency to take over districts or to sort of step in when a school is continually failing in 2015. Um, Soon after that, Mike Morath became the Texas Education Agency commissioner. Who is Morath and like what sort of role has he played in these recent takeovers that we've seen?
Yeah, so a couple things too. I would note that you're right that in 2015, a new state law kind of created the scenario that we're talking about now with, either close the campus or, initiate a full, scale takeover. I should note before that though, the education agency actually, they provided data dating back as far as 2000, right? That kind of tracks that, formerly a lot of these kind of interventions and takeovers, which is also the case nationally as well, is that they've more so been related to like financial challenges, fiscal challenges. And so what we've seen, since the 2015 law is a shift to more of those takeovers being about poor academic performance, right? By the district. And so we've seen that in places like Houston, more recently, obviously in Fort Worth, and then obviously the three that we're talking about here. But yeah, I mean, talk about Education Commissioner Mike Morath. He's a really interesting guy. He's very, I always think of him, he's very data centered, and he's a systems guy, right? He's an entrepreneur, background, right? He was a member of the Dallas ISD school board before he became the education commissioner. And so you have to almost look at it from his perspective. He looks at things through the lens of systems, right? And, when you're in the business world, you're thinking about, well, if something isn't happening, what's the reason for that? And a lot of times, the commissioner is going to point to governance, right? He's going to look at, what are the trends that we're seeing in the district? Maybe it is one campus that triggers the intervention, but if you read his letters, he kind of talks about some of the, longer term trends. Like, for example, if you have a district that has multiple years of failing campuses or, has seen, various struggles and whatnot, he's been very clear in his letters and his messaging to the districts that he sees that as a failure of the school boards and leadership. And so interesting dynamic there. And again, there's a lot of people don't necessarily see it the same way. There is nuance to that, but that is kind of who he is and how he's looking at it and how he's articulated his reasoning for feeling like these interventions are necessary.
Yeah, I think folks in Marath's camps, we think of them as like pro accountability. They'll say, at a certain point, there needs to be a threshold for if students are not performing well enough on tests, it means that they do not have the skills that they need to succeed later on in life. And so the school is not serving those students, at least in that way. And so there needs to be a certain threshold where we decide, a school district is not doing enough, or they need help. And the state is positioned with its resources to come in and provide that like extra support. But that threshold, you mentioned the 2015 law, that really changed. And so now we've decided five failing ratings at one campus is enough for a whole district to be taken over. I think some of the controversy is, it is one campus. And so when you have these giant school districts, we're seeing some of our biggest school districts in Texas being taken over, Houston and Fort Worth. There's questions coming up about like, should one school alone be enough for an entire district to lose all its local control?
Right. I mean, you guys wrote about this in as just like one example of like the Beaumont district, which was recent, now is facing takeover. I guess they have a chance to appeal. There's like a lot of steps, but they have two school districts. I mean, Beaumont, a decent sized city. They've got two schools, I should say, that have had 5 years of failing grades. The elementary school that they're looking at has never earned an acceptable rating. The middle school has gone 11 years without one. The president of the school board said, they were working on it. They're trying to like improve this. It's a process. He says sort of like, well, why are we taking over the whole school district instead of shutting down those two campuses? It does sound like, I mean, generally speaking, the board would have the authority to shut down those campuses. They're sort of saying, well, we're working on it. We're trying to like fix these. I mean, I think it is like parents are like, I don't want my kid to go to a failing school. I don't want my kid to like, how do people sort of talk about balancing this need for like you said, we do need schools to be performing with like the whole district needs to be taken over to sort of ameliorate maybe problems at a couple of schools?
Yeah, I would know one thing. I think this whole conversation, I mentioned earlier that there is nuance to it because I think on the flip side of where the commissioner is coming from is you look at the reality of education and educating children. It's really hard, right? It's not like a business per se, right? Where kids are not a commodity, right? It's like they need time and investment and things of that nature. And if you look at the characteristics actually of the three schools that were taken over, and we've also seen this, trend wise, also in Fort Worth and in Houston, these are districts with significantly high numbers of students who come from lower income households, right? Free or reduced lunch, which is an indicator of poverty in the state and at the federal level as well. These are districts that have a majority Black and Hispanic student populations as well. And so what that makes me think automatically as a reporter, I come in, I start thinking about, okay, we know that, poverty has an impact on how students perform, right? You look at the remarks from the Beaumont, school board member. He mentioned, for example, we need more family engagement, right? That could help us kind of fix this issue. Okay, you look at family engagement. Let's unpack that a little bit, right? Like, if you have a family, for example, and we know these exist in Texas, families who work multiple jobs, right, and may not have the ability to sit at home after school and read to their child, or to do the things that also have proven to boost academic performance, then is that necessarily a failure of the school district, or is it a collective kind of effort, collaboration between family, the school, community resources, things of that nature? And so that's why I say it's a little bit more nuanced, I think, when we talk about this. And this is why these are controversial nationally, right? I mean, you look at, I was actually, before our conversation, just refreshing myself on some of the national data on this, and it was really interesting because there was a study, I think it was looking at like 35 takeovers between like sometime in the 2010s, and it was shown on average to not really boost academic achievement in math and reading, but also it had shown kind of harmful effects, particularly on majority Black school districts. And it's not, and same thing when it comes to fiscal challenges for majority Black school districts, but not necessarily the same for other groups, right? And so it's just so much more nuance when we talk about education. And Sneha, I'll let you chime in, but it's just interesting to me, like when we talk about these, oftentimes it's about, you hear people talk about governance and, they try to compare districts of similar kind of demographic makeups. But again, education is just so nuanced, and why a kid is not achieving, it's not always necessarily because of the district or a teacher. Maybe it is, but it's just more nuanced than that.
And just for context, we talked a little bit about Beaumont. So all of the 4 school districts that have been taken over this year, the school, the one campus that triggered that takeover, the campuses that triggered those takeovers, were all serving predominantly Black and brown students and were in predominantly low income areas. And so it's, it's a question of like, is a takeover a one size fits all solution? Like, can we really use that as a measure to go into communities, especially when we now have this pattern of these are communities that tend to have less resources, or maybe these are communities that are struggling to serve their students for different reasons that all contribute, that show up in the academic results, but there are bigger root causes.
Which I think goes to this broader question, right, of that the state has been grappling with. I think nationally we've been grappling with this, right, for a long time, which is like, how do you measure how a school is performing? And often that comes to how do you measure how like a student is learning? But as we were joking about before, like a big part of this is the STAR test, right? Like, how do we measure? I don't know. I send my kid to first grade and I want them to be ready to go to second grade. How do I know if they're doing that? And then more importantly, I want to move to a school district where if my kid goes into first grade, they'll be leaving, ready to do second grade. Like, how do I assess if a district is good or performing? Which seems, to your point, like on the systems front, like so straightforward, right? Just like, we'll test them all. Tell us if they're doing well or not. It is so much more complicated than that. Sneha, can you tell us a little bit about like this battle over accountability ratings?
Yeah, I think when we talk about school accountability and the accountability system, it's really a question of how do we measure like whether schools are successful in serving its students, and what does it mean to truly serve students. And I think to your point, Eleanor, like Testing is kind of the easiest metric. You have a standardized test, you can apply it to all students, and I think there is legitimacy to that, and you want students to have those like math and reading skills that they need to go on to be ready for college, to get the jobs that they want to get that are high paying and will help them create the life that they want after they leave the school systems. But there's other metrics too, right? We like things like social emotional well-being, like how students are like showing up to class mentally, like their mental health, how that's doing, and all of that is way harder to measure, right? There's no standardized metric for that, and so then it becomes this complicated thing. And so I think there's really been a push in Texas to think about other measures that go beyond testing in our accountability system. And the state is kind of right now, the legislature has directed them to sort of explore some of that, but we haven't seen that really fully implemented in the accountability system. Like as it stands right now, even with the legislation that passed this past legislative session, standardized testing is still the major metric, and that was the standardized test. Even though it is being overhauled, we have to see, it still remains to be seen the effects that will have, but that is a widely unpopular test because of the pressure it puts on students, because some people don't feel like it's a good metric of how students are doing.
And and also to add to that, I mean, I wrote a story earlier this year looking at the Fort Worth takeover specifically, and how the STAR test plays an outsized role in really determining the academic accountability system it's a huge factor in it, right? And it was a test. I went back and looked at some of the statements from lawmakers, right, and there seemed to be consensus, right, that belief that the STAR test had set students up to fail, right? Not my words, right? The words of actual lawmakers who voted to phase out this test by 2027. And so I think a lot of that belief too, you mentioned the unpopularity of the test. It's not just so much the STAR test as it is like the culture of, kind of high stakes testing, right? Where it's like, what is, to your point, what is the goal of education, right? Is it to teach students critical thinking skills, or is it to, get them to achieve on tests, right? And some people may argue where those things are kind of, tied together, but there are other people who see it differently. And so it's just but it goes back to talk about conversations between local and state control, right? It's going to vary by community. There are some communities who may think that, standardized testing is the way they want student performance to be measured. And then you have other communities elsewhere who think it's more nuanced, right? Like who, they want to make sure that their kids are, well-rounded people who are not just exceptional students, but exceptional people, right? In the world, we hear that a lot too. And I remember that from a story I did some months ago. And so it's just more nuance. And I think locally, community by community is gonna vary in terms of what values people hold about education.
I spent some time in a neighborhood in Austin that was really it's a predominantly refugee immigrant community, and Austin isn't facing a takeover yet, but this one middle school, along with a couple others in the Austin school district, is close to that 5 threshold. They're at about 4 now. And the parents were devastated that the district was considering shutting them down. They were fighting to stay open. They knew that their kids weren't performing well on the standardized test, but they were telling me, hey, this is not a fair metric. Our kids, English is their first language. They can't even really understand this test that they're taking. And also we show up every day. We are really engaged, and the teachers are serving our students in a way that is different than just a test. The students feel welcome. They feel safe. Their older kids that graduated from that middle school went on to be successful. And so it was this disconnect where, they were feeling the school district and the state, they were feeling this pressure coming down on them saying the school is not doing good enough, but it was the community that was saying, actually, we think they are doing a great job. We don't want leadership to change. So you do see these tensions come into play.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense, right? Like if you have a district or a specific school that's serving children who, maybe are English language learners, or their parents are English language learners, you're just dealing with a different set of challenges. Or, like you said, a district that is, children are showing up hungry. They're showing up they're having housing instability. They're dealing with all of these challenges to say well, how do they perform on this test versus, these kids who are maybe their parents are reading to them from a very young age. They, maybe are able to have, a more robust sort of, before they come to school, like more robust education, like they're showing up with all the best tools and everything. Like, how do we put those next to each other and say, well, that's enough for us to take over? But then, it's like this is the sort of inherent tension the state certainly is grappling with. And to your point, like legislators, it seems like really are grappling with this, right? Like I think we sometimes, give our legislators a hard time for like sometimes just like throwing up their hands at these complicated issues or not like digging in on them to find like a reasonable solution. It does sound like where we are now is everyone sort of agreeing, at least with the testing, we need a better solution. We don't know what that is. I mean, are there any examples that either of you guys have encountered, like nationally, or things you're hearing from lawmakers and experts on, like, how should we be measuring schools? Is there any good model for this?
It's interesting. The first thing that comes to mind when you ask the question, aside from there's been really good reporting from places like Texas Monthly and others that have kind of gone locally and looked at how there's like coalitions of districts in the state that are kind of wrestling with this very issue and topic and really trying to find ways to be more innovative with their kind of local accountability indicators and things of that nature. But I would actually go to the state school voucher program because it's an interesting place to start. And the reason I say that is because nationally, right, we've seen this more as these programs have grown in size. Obviously, Texas is huge in this conversation now. Is we've seen more and more of a shift over the years from, hey, we shouldn't be measuring the success of these programs by standardized testing. We should be looking at measures like parent satisfaction. We should be looking at at TribFest actually more recently. One of the Ed Choice representatives, huge school voucher, school choice kind of supporter. He cited like high school graduation rates and things of that nature, right? Other metrics that really go beyond kind of testing infrastructure and puts it more in the hands of like parents and families and what they feel is most important. You compare and contrast that though to the most recent legislative session where you've had people to say, hey, when it comes to accountability, you've agreed through policy that we should be taking a more holistic view of this, right? We should be considering more things like what do local communities feel about their schools, because that's the way we're going to measure the success of this program in particular, right? That we're investing at the start $1 billion in, and probably more to come after that. But we're not seeing the same with public schools. And the interesting part is too, if you actually talk to voucher advocates, ESA advocates, they'll actually tell you that they agree that public schools are held to a standard that they feel is unfair, right? I've had that conversation with folks, in that camp before who said they agree with that. And so to me, it's just really interesting because it just shows there may be a little bit of a contradiction there, or at least in the eyes of people who think that, again, the local control and accountability component is important. But then you look at, programs, elsewhere.
Right. It's like almost like if we were to design a school accountability system from scratch, which in some ways we're doing with the voucher system, would it look anything like how we hold public schools accountable? It sounds like you're sort of saying, so far at least.
Yeah, and what lawmakers are saying is, hey, let parents decide.
Yeah. Which works better for private education than public.
Right, but when you have, I think the difference here is that now, the state is putting its own funding behind it, right?
They're investing.
So there is I think there's an expectation of accountability from, advocates when you think about, how do we know our return on investment?
Yeah.
So I don't know if you had anything to.
I mean, what we saw this legislative session is that tension came up, right? Like, why are we holding private schools to different standards than our public schools? But there was discussion, but when it came to actually the legislation, lawmakers weren't in the end willing to really do an entire revision of the accountability system. They said, hey, TEA, you should look into different metrics. Some, for example, were like workforce training, like or students complaining CTE classes, that kind of thing, but like pre-K participation. So they're exploring it, but it's not quite the same. We're not seeing those things really being weaved into the accountability system.
That's interesting. I mean, I know, Sneha, you do a lot of reporting on sort of like pathways to employment that maybe are not like, did you get a 4.0 GPA, get a 2,400 on your SAT, and get enrolled in Harvard, right? It's like, we don't need that for every student. We need students to learn to become airplane mechanics. We need them to learn to become, all kinds of things. Like, does the current accountability system take into account schools that are doing a good job preparing students for the workforce that maybe doesn't need like the same metrics that show up on testing?
In short, no, because it is so depends on this standardized testing system. And I think you could argue that those like STEM jobs that don't require a college degree, they still need you to have those like critical math skills or science skills to really succeed in those roles. But we're not really thinking deeply about beyond the standardized test. And so for as long as we're not doing that, we're not really thinking about the student in a real holistic way.
And education issue, and they'll probably say, well, if you look at our accountability system, we also look at things like college and career, military readiness, things of that nature. But again, back to Sneha's point, the STAR test is king, right? The standardized test is king when you look at the system, right? And kind of what's measured the most heavily, if that makes sense.
And it does make sense, just like human nature wise, that until we have something better, everyone can say all the live long day that they don't think the STAR test is a good metric, but those results come out,
It's business as usual,
right?
For
Like,
people. Yeah.
Well, if we do have this, and what are we going to not look at it? And so I think as long as that is there, it's like becomes the metric, even if everyone is saying, well, we don't think it's a great metric, but it's the metric that we have.
Jaden mentioned there is a metric in the accountability system that is smaller, what we call the college and career readiness benchmark. But when I talk to school leaders, they're saying it's become a sort of carrot and stick. So in order to meet that benchmark, maybe you need a certain number of students or percentage of your students to be enrolled in like career readiness classes. But that's sort of like, once you have that incentive, you can just funnel students into like a Word document class where you master Word documents, but it's not actually the same thing as making sure that they're successful or have options for them for a career that's not college.
Right. I mean, it almost seems, again, human nature that is, if you create a metric, people will go to great lengths to meet that metric, even if it's sort of, and also will teach them what they need to know. But also, like, we need this many kids to apply for college. When I was in high school, my high school had a 100% college acceptance rate that they were like very dedicated to keeping, which meant every student had to, in addition to applying to all the colleges that they wanted to apply to, had to apply to like a safety school they absolutely could get into, so that like nobody was going to sort of slip through the cracks of like, oh, I just didn't end up getting in anywhere. And it's like, I remember a kid wanted to go to like culinary school and they were like, all good. You also have to be accepted to a 4-year college because we need to maintain this 100% 4-year college acceptance rate. And it's like, inevitable that if you create a metric, schools will go to great lengths to meet that.
Yeah, it reminds me too. We were talking about this, and I kind of hinted at it earlier, right? When we were talking about some of the demographic makeups of like the schools and things of that nature, right? These are this whole conversation keeps me up at night. But I thought about this a lot recently. It's like, the commissioner, Commissioner Marath has often talked about, like he sees these as systemic failures that are obviously disproportionately affecting, Black and brown students, right? And to me, the interesting kind of nuance to that is like, if you look, obviously we know that academic achievement, like nationally and academic achievement gaps, things of that nature, right? We understand kind of what that looks like and how it, again, disproportionately, harms or, more negative results for our Black and brown students. But where the commissioner maybe does have a point when you talk about systemic, issues, right? If you look at discipline data, right, which I've done more recently, like dating back to maybe like 07, 08, 08, 09, something like that. Every single year, you have Black and brown students who are, particularly Black students, right, are overrepresented in out-of-school suspensions and in-school suspensions. Any discipline category or metric you can think of, they're overrepresented in those things, right? You read anecdotally stories like in Barbers Hill ISD, there was a student, the huge kind of court battle where, basically, he had his hair a certain way, and, the district wasn't favorable for that. It violated their dress code, and, he wasn't able to go to school, right? The question I often have, right, those things have legitimate effects on, how students see themselves in school, right? Which also has a trickle-down effect to academic achievement and like how students perform. And so certainly there's a conversation to be had, right? It's like certainly, you can talk all day and debate, should we be looking at academic achievement and things of those nature, not looking at academic achievement, but looking at like standardized testing and things of that nature to measure student performance. But to be fair, there are things that school districts systemically, when it comes to educating the most vulnerable kids, right? Obstacles that, to be honest with you, when you look at the data, they certainly have to overcome. Because I don't know if you can come, to any, to the commissioner, to the reporter, and say inherently that if you look at discipline, individually, these sets of students are just more problem. That's just not how it works. And so certainly there are systemic issues when it comes to creating an educational environment where these kids can thrive. And that's something that between the state, local communities, and at the district level are going to have to figure out.
And I think it's also a question of resources, and the way our educational system is set up is schools that are in poor communities are working with fewer resources. And so that is a challenge when you're trying to get students who are like high need, maybe aren't eating, don't have food at home, and are coming to school with more needs that they need the school to then meet. But the school is working with fewer resources, and then you want them to go and show up to the test and pass with flying colors. That's complicated. And someone like Commissioner Marath will say, there are bright spots. He'll point to specifically places in districts in South Texas that have maybe limited resources, or it is like a high percentage of students who are economically disadvantaged, and they're still able to perform well. And so, we need to look into why exactly that is. But on a whole, those are bright spots. Those are outliers. On a whole, we are still seeing this trend of, when you have fewer resources, when you are in poor communities, students are performing worse on these tests, and you can imagine for all the reasons that we've talked about.
Yeah, it definitely seems like it's all like so intertwined that it's, I don't envy the people who do have to create policy around this, because it's like very hard to fix one piece without sort of fixing the whole thing. For these districts that are sort of staring down either potentially a takeover, they've been sort of informed about this, or the ones, like you said, Austin, some others that are really on the precipice here. I want to sort of look back at Houston ISD, which has been under takeover for a couple of years, and what has been the impact of that? How have we seen that play out? Like, what do these districts sort of have to look forward to in terms of how that might go?
Houston ISD is fascinating. It is the way the takeover has played out has been incredibly controversial. On one hand, you have a whole coalition of community members that have come in and have formulated and organized just around fighting back against Mike Miles, which is
why do they have such
the
Mike and Mike?
the
Yeah,
two
Mike
yeah.
Miles
Yeah.
is the state appointed superintendent. Mike Marath, the TEA commissioner. Yeah.
But Mike Miles, the commissioner that Marath appointed.
The superintendent that, oh my gosh.
I think
it's just a word tongue twister here. But
if we're going to get other state appointed superintendents, let's try to use some different
Yeah,
names
please.
next time.
Less
Instead of
M's,
one request
less
to the
M's.
TEA. Yeah.
But yes,
Yeah.
let me try a third time. But Mike Miles is the superintendent that the commissioner appointed. And so he's just had a really controversial approach. On one hand, you have this coalition of community members that have really fought against this. But then you also have these state lawmakers that have really lauded him and applauded him and said, what Superintendent Miles is doing should be emulated across the state. So I really think because of that, those tensions, we really need to be paying attention to what is happening in Houston as really a possible forecast for what could be happening, what we could see having a ripple effect across Texas. And so, there has been, to answer your question, Eleanor, there has been a big jump in improvement in test scores, right? Like we had no F ratings.
From 56 and 22, 23 before the
In the
takeover.
Houston ISD.
In Houston ISD. To go from 56 underperforming to 0, that is, no one can argue with what a jump, what an improvement that is on the metrics, right? And so we're seeing test scores improve across every subject, but I think the question community members are asking is at what cost, right? Like we've seen teachers leave in droves. We've seen students unenroll in droves. There's been a question of like, how much can we really gain from or gather from these improvements in test scores when we know some students are being held back grades in math and science? So it's really this tension that's happening right now. It's like, okay, we are seeing test gains, but is testing to come back to really, is it the end all be all?
Yeah, and what state-appointed superintendent Mike Miles has implemented that. I'm glad I got that right
Yeah,
on the first
yeah.
try. Mike
I
Miles.
saw your
Yeah,
brain
yeah, yeah,
working.
yeah.
Yeah.
Has so basically, the basis of what he's doing there is through this reform system known as the new education system, right? They refer to it as NES locally, right? And so some of the features of that, which people maybe have read about, right, like daily quizzes, kind of scripted, curriculum where teachers are held to that and make sure that everybody's kind of aligned across the board, creating kind of team centers, in part for discipline, but also for, if you need to pull, kids out of class because they're not caught up on a certain lesson, the class moves on, we'll pull the kid out and try to get them caught up, right? Some of those features. And I think the way people have described it locally is more of kind of what I've seen, right, is more of like a people say like a militaristic approach to education, right? And so some of the trade-off, and when you talk to people locally, it's like, okay, we're seeing these gains, but to Sneha's point, at what cost? And some researchers too, more recently I was speaking with a researcher in North Texas, they're also thinking about to what extent, and just for background, in the enrollment losses that we're seeing. So enrollment's technically up across the state, but every community is like different. And so Houston, is seeing, dramatic drops in enrollment. But what's kind of raised the alarm of local reporters and researchers is that the enrollment drops are more profound in the schools where those reforms are most targeted. And so the question becomes, to what extent, we're seeing a lot of teacher and student turnover. From a student turnover standpoint, how much of that factors into some of the changes, significant gains in the outcomes that we're seeing, right? Historically, if you look at some of these, similar scenarios. I remember reading a book a while back, and the author was talking about how maybe it was in New York or California, one major school district nonetheless, and they were talking about how the local community was concerned that demography, right, the significant changes in enrollment, changes in student populations. So what are you testing the same children who maybe before had been struggling and therefore were, maybe part of why test scores have been lower. Again, I'm not saying that that's the case, but I'm just saying that Houston is a very fascinating case study because there's just so much nuance and there's a lot of information and things that we honestly probably won't even know until years from now when it's all said and done and we can look back and say, okay, what actually happened, what worked and what didn't.
What do we know about where the kids who are disenrolling, where are they going?
Yeah, that's a great question. Locally, and I want to give a huge shout out to the local reporters at the Houston Chronicles. They've done some really good stuff on this. Anecdotally speaking, we know through local reporting, right, that there have been families that have just pulled their kids out of those schools because they didn't like the takeover and enrolled them in other places. But that's also a big question mark, right? Like, Sneha and I've talked about this before too. It's like, where are you have to assume, right, if you're seeing have some of those kids dropped out of school altogether, like where? So there is a lot of nuance to that. The commissioners have been asked about that. By none other than Evan Smith, right? I was at a recent deal there, and he was asked about the teacher turnover and drops in enrollment, and there really didn't seem to be kind of a clear or cohesive understanding as to like what actually is happening there as it pertains to those particular changes in changes at the district level, but certainly things that I think the local reporters, everybody's kind of thinking about, and as we kind of move forward and continue to kind of measure, what the success or lack thereof, or however people look at it, what that looks like.
I especially wonder about that given that the cuts that have been made is to services like wraparound services like supporting students experiencing homelessness. So then all of these things you can imagine are sort of coming together. So it's a good question. I think all the reporters folks are asking right now.
Yeah, certainly it doesn't sound like these are families that are like necessarily in a position to say like, oh, let's move to a wealthier district to get our kid into a better school, or let's get our kid enrolled in a private school. Maybe it sounds like maybe some of them are, but
That's a privilege too, right? To be able to just say
like, oh yeah. So that's really, really interesting. And I think, like you said, it'll be years of sort of unpacking, what worked, what didn't. Doesn't sound like we'll ever get a definitive like that was right or wrong. It's just sort of like there were probably some gains and probably at some costs.
And it'll depend. Yeah, it'll depend on kind of local values, right? Because you have a lot of parents there locally who feel like takeover isn't what's best for them. But if you look at a place like Fort Worth, you have families who are kind of welcoming it a little bit. Mm-hmm. Not saying that's the consensus or anything, but you've seen families who say, hey, maybe this is what's best for the district. And so, really fascinating there. But again, let's go back to that local kind of community component.
And it is interesting. That Houston is the sort of best example we have so far because like what a behemoth. Like, it's like,
Oh, yeah.
if we had like a small rural district where you could say, like, this is our laboratory for seeing it, like Houston, just a larger school district, I assume, than many states have in terms of enrollment in just one of the biggest in the country. Is just what a place to start this, this effort.
And look, one last thought too, and Sneh, I don't know if you have thoughts on this, but like, if the goal is systemic reform, but ultimately what's going to happen once the takeover ultimately ends, because they will end at some point, you shift back to local control, elected school board members and a superintendent. Is it that they're going to just continue what Mike Miles or these other state appointed superintendents are doing, or that are they going to implement their own vision? And like, if the goal is systemic reform, long term, how do you ensure if there are changes made by this administration that it's going to carry on to the next? There's no way you can guarantee that.
Especially if the community is sort of throwing their hands and saying, we don't agree with this
Right, or
approach,
fighting it
right?
the whole way.
Yeah.
So it is really fascinating. And I also think about, the process of the state takeover. The TEA will say, the school districts have a chance to fight it, to preempt it. But when you reach this like 4 failing grades, 5 failing grades threshold, I really wondered, do schools really have a fighting chance to stave off control? They have an option where they can enter a partnership with a charter school, and that buys them a little bit more time. But
Which Beaumont did that. Yeah.
Beaumont did do that, and a number of the schools did do that. But then you also have this option to maybe you shut down the school before the TEA comes in. But then in a lot of these instances, Fort Worth and a bunch of these school districts that are being taken over, they did shut down the school, and TEA came in and said, hey, that actually still wasn't enough. You hit the threshold, so it doesn't matter if the school is shut down. We're still going to come over and take over the entire district. So you really wonder like how much of the local say is really coming to play here.
I mean, Jane, your comment sort of brings me to my final question, which is like, how does a district get out of state takeover? Have we seen that happen?
Yeah, so it's super interesting. So basically, what we know is we can look at the case of Houston, right? The commissioner has set, was it maybe a handful? I'll say 3. Maybe I'm missing a couple, but generally speaking, a handful of kind of parameters that the district needs to meet to begin the transition. But ultimately, like, there is kind of a cutoff. So in the Houston's case, for example, we know that it'll extend at least through 2027, and at that point. And it started in 2023. So 2027, and at that point, the commissioner actually has to begin the transition back to local control, which is also a very incremental process, right? It's like, only a certain, maybe a certain number of school board members come back at first. And then, like, so it's not like it's going to end in 2027. So it's going to be gradually kind of phased out back into the hands of kind of the local school board. And obviously, they could choose. One thing that's interesting, we don't know if this is going to happen. A local school board could decide to say, hey, we like the state appointed superintendent, we can keep them around. That's also a possibility. I don't know how likely that is, but certainly something that could happen as well.
Yeah, it's just an interesting and obviously, as we alluded to at the beginning, there's so much like tension between state and local control that has nothing to do with school performance. It has a lot to do with, cities, and particularly like these more politically blue leaning cities feeling, the sort of pressure of the red leaning state government that like underpins a lot of this. And also, like, this is a thing that people really, really care about, right? Like, we talk about this a lot at the Tribune. We have like a school explorers page on our website that is like consistently our most clicked page.
It's probably me, because I do a lot of research on
Yeah,
that,
it's
by
just
the way.
Jade and just refresh.
Yeah.
But it's like people is probably the thing people care about the most, right? Is like what schools are performing, is how they make decisions about where they live. It's how they make decisions about how they want to spend their money, what they want to invest in, all those kind of things. And I think, the state obviously feels that pressure. These local communities feel that pressure. And it sounds like this is just like the tool they've settled on for now to sort of execute on the state's vision, at least, of how to improve that.
And to be clear, right, this is also one of those issues that really isn't divided neatly along like partisan lines. Like when you talk about like takeovers, like nationally, and if you look at the 2015 law, it was Harold Dutton who was the one who basically was responsible for the trigger, that came into it. And a lot of his frustration had been with looking at these predominantly black and brown schools in his community in Houston. He's like, even if you give districts, resources from his standpoint, he's like, we're still not seeing what we need to see, right? You can look at discipline, right? You can, we know what impact, for example, something as simple term wise, like as teacher diversity is, and how students who have teachers who look like them and reflect their experiences, like that actually has shown to also have positive effects on academic outcomes, right? His question is like, what are districts doing with the controllables, right? Like, no circumstance is going to be perfect, but when you do have certain resources and the power to do things, what are you changing? And so I'm only bringing that up as an example to show,
this
like,
is not
it's not just a Republican thing.
Right.
Yeah,
And just to add,
Yeah.
like a conservative value, a long conservative value has been less governance,
And
right?
local
so
control.
and local
Right.
control,
Right.
and so
We've seen
certainly
that shift a
yes,
little bit
and
in recent
certainly we've
years
seen-
with in Texas specifically.
Oh,
but
yeah,
yes, but
Yeah.
certainly like local control and less government and just I think a lot of people are concerned about, are we doing enough for Black and brown students? And like you said, that doesn't necessarily it cuts across party lines in interesting ways.
And the commissioners acknowledged too these debates as well. During his discussion with Evan, he kind of acknowledged that, some of the, opposition, maybe to Fort Worth and things of that nature. He talked about how, hey, those are valid points and those are things that I have to consider. But ultimately, he articulates that he feels like he's doing what's best for students. And that's going to depend on the person, their background, what their values are, and how they look at education.
Right. It's a little bit like who is best positioned to really do what's best and meet these needs of the students. And you're seeing that in local folks saying, hey, this is our community. We know these students. We know these families. And then the state saying, well, we have the resources, we have the tools and the academic knowledge that we can come in and really appoint who we need to really meet these like very specific needs. So
Well, I mean, it's a very complicated thing, but I appreciate you guys sort of breaking that down and your ongoing coverage on, what does seem to at least be a recent uptick in, takeovers. That was Sneha Day and Jaden Edison. You can find their work at the Texas Tribune or at texastribune.org. Drop the it's cleaner. That is it for this week's episode of the TribCast for December 16th. You can find our podcast anywhere you get your podcasts, or you can watch us on YouTube. Our producers are Rob and Chris. Our theme music is composed by Rob, and we will see you next week.